The front door closed behind me with a soft click, and I stood in the entrance of my apartment for a moment, allowing my eyes to adjust to the familiar darkness of the space that I had inhabited for the past 5 years. It was nearly midnight, and I had just returned from a late dinner with colleagues from work, an obligatory social gathering that had stretched far longer than I would have preferred. The evening had been the kind of mundane urban experience that characterizes much of modern existence. Small talk about projects and weather, the exchange of professional pleasantries, the performance of social adequacy that allows people to coexist in shared spaces without genuine connection or meaningful engagement. I was tired, mentally depleted from the effort of maintaining the appropriate facial expressions and conversational rhythm, and I was looking forward to the solitude that my apartment promised. I switched on the lights and moved deeper into my living space, dropping my keys on the small table by the door and removing my jacket. The apartment looked exactly as I had left it that morning, neat, orderly, with everything in its designated place. The furniture arranged itself in comfortable geometric patterns, the books on the shelf aligned with precision, the kitchen gleaming with the kind of cleanliness that came from obsessive attention to detail. This was how I preferred my living space, controlled and organized, a refuge from the chaos and unpredictability of the external world. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the window at the street below, where the occasional car passed and a few late-night pedestrians made their way along the sidewalk. It was as I was turning away from the window that I first became aware of something unusual. There was a quality to the air in the apartment that seemed different from how it normally felt. A subtle alteration in the atmosphere that I could not immediately identify or articulate. It was not a smell precisely, though there was something vaguely olfactory about the sensation. It was more like a presence, a density to the air itself, as though something or someone had added weight to the space while I had been gone. I stood very still for a moment, extending my awareness through the apartment, attempting to identify what had triggered this sensation of wrongness. But there was nothing concrete that I could point to. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Nothing was obviously out of place. I told myself that I was simply tired, that my exhausted mind was generating false impressions, that the sensation I was experiencing was nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination that had been primed by the unsettling experience of being in social situations for an extended period. I finished my water, washed the glass, and placed it in the drying rack with the same precision with which I maintained the rest of my living space. I moved through my nighttime routine with deliberate normalcy, attempting to override the vague sense of unease that was beginning to establish itself in my consciousness. But despite my attempts to rationalize the sensation away, I could not entirely suppress the awareness that something was fundamentally different about my apartment, something that went beyond the physical arrangement of objects in space. As I prepared for bed, changing into the clothes that I typically wore for sleeping and going through the ablutions that preceded rest, I found myself becoming increasingly alert rather than increasingly drowsy. My nervous system seemed to have responded to something in the environment with a subtle but persistent activation. I lay in bed in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my mind refusing to settle into the state of relaxation that typically preceded sleep. The darkness of my bedroom seemed different somehow, heavier, more present, as though it was not merely the absence of light, but rather the presence of something that was absorbing light, consuming it, making the darkness itself into a material thing rather than a simple absence. I got up and turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. My bedroom looked exactly as it always did. The bed was neatly made with the exception of the depression where I had been lying. The dresser held the same collection of items in the same arrangement. The closet door was closed. The window showed the same view of the fire escape and the brick wall of the building next door that I had been looking at every night for 5 years. There was nothing unusual, nothing that could reasonably be interpreted as a threat or a cause for alarm. And yet, when I turned off the light and lay back down in the darkness, that sense of presence returned, that awareness of something other in the space with me. I tried to convince myself that what I was experiencing was entirely psychological, the result of stress and fatigue, and the general unease that comes from being in social situations for extended periods. The mind, I reminded myself, is extremely skilled at generating patterns and finding meaning in randomness. The brain interprets ambiguous sensory information through the filter of expectations and fears, often creating elaborate narratives to explain what are actually quite simple and mundane phenomena. What I was experiencing was almost certainly a manifestation of this cognitive tendency, nothing more. I had read enough about the psychology of perception and interpretation to understand that my current experience was likely a false positive, my threat detection system activated by something that posed no actual danger. But despite these rational arguments, I found myself unable to relax, unable to convince my nervous system that there was nothing to be concerned about. I lay in the darkness for what felt like hours, though when I checked my phone, only about 40 minutes had passed. My heart rate was elevated, my breathing somewhat shallow, my muscles tense with a kind of low-grade readiness. I was responding to the environment as though I was in a state of mild danger, even though I could identify no objective source of that danger. Finally, around 3 in the morning, I gave up on the attempt to sleep. I rose from bed, turned on the lights throughout the apartment, and began a systematic search of the space. I opened every closet, looked under every piece of furniture, checked behind curtains and in the corners of rooms. I examined the front door and the windows to confirm that they were all locked and showed no signs of tampering. I looked in the kitchen cabinets and behind the shower curtain in the bathroom. My search revealed nothing. There was no indication that anyone had entered my apartment, no sign of an intruder or an unwanted presence. Everything was exactly as it should have been, exactly as I had left it, and yet when I finally turned off the lights and attempted once again to settle into sleep as the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, that sense of presence remained. It was as though something had attached itself to me, had come home with me from wherever I had been, and was now settling into the space that I occupied, preparing to establish itself in my life. I lay in the growing light of early morning, exhausted and frustrated by my inability to sleep, increasingly convinced that something was genuinely wrong, even though I could provide no evidence to support this conviction. The next day passed in a state of sleep-deprived haze. I called in sick to work, claiming a migraine that was not entirely fictional, given the pounding headache that had developed from my lack of sleep. I spent the day moving through my apartment like a ghost, attempting various activities in an attempt to make the time pass and to distract myself from the persistent sense of wrongness that continued to permeate my living space. I read, but found that I could not concentrate on the words. I watched television, but found that I was not processing what I was seeing. I attempted to work on a personal project that I had been meaning to complete for weeks, but found that I could not generate the focus or the motivation to engage with it in any meaningful way. By evening, exhaustion finally began to overcome the nervous activation that had kept me awake the previous night. I fell asleep around 9 in the evening, slumped on my couch with the television playing in the background. I woke several hours later, disoriented and stiff, my neck at an awkward angle that would probably result in pain the following day. I moved to my bedroom and lay down properly, falling back into sleep almost immediately. But the sleep was not restful. I experienced a series of dreams that were unsettling in their vividness and their emotional tone. In these dreams, I was in my apartment, but the space was subtly altered, rearranged in ways that made it feel unfamiliar and threatening. In some of the dreams, there were shapes moving in the periphery of my vision, entities that I could almost but not quite see, that seemed to be waiting for something or watching me. In other dreams, I was trying to leave the apartment, but the door would not open, the windows were sealed, and the walls seemed to be moving closer, the space contracting around me. I woke from these dreams in a state of acute anxiety, my heart pounding, my skin covered in a thin layer of perspiration. It was on the 4th night of this pattern that I first began to consider the possibility that something literal and concrete had actually come home with me. Not some psychological manifestation or a product of my overactive imagination, but something real, something with actual presence in the physical world, something that had attached itself to me during the evening out and had followed me back to my apartment. The thought was unsettling enough that I almost immediately attempted to suppress it, to push it away, and returned to the safer interpretation that what I was experiencing was entirely in my mind. But once the thought had formed, it proved difficult to dislodge. I began to research online, searching for information about entities that might attach themselves to people, about spiritual presences or supernatural phenomena that could explain what I was experiencing. What I found was a vast landscape of websites, forums, and discussion boards filled with people describing experiences that bore remarkable similarity to my own. People talked about coming home and feeling that something had come with them, about the presence of entities that could not be seen or directly detected, but that made themselves known through subtle alterations in the environment. Some of these accounts were clearly the product of active imagination or mental illness, but others were described with such specificity and such apparent sincerity that I found myself drawn into a consideration of the possibility that such phenomena might be real. I read accounts of shadow figures, of entities that existed in the peripheral vision and disappeared when one tried to look directly at them. I read descriptions of presences that seemed to feed on certain types of emotional states that grew stronger when the person hosting them experienced anxiety or fear. I read testimonies from people who had sought help from paranormal investigators, from religious leaders, from mental health professionals, from spiritualists and shamans and alternative healers of various types. The testimonies described a range of outcomes, from people who had successfully rid themselves of the entities to people who had become resigned to living with them, understanding them as a permanent alteration to their reality. I was aware, even as I was reading these accounts, that I might be engaging in a process of cognitive confirmation bias, of seeking out information that confirmed my emerging hypothesis about what was happening while ignoring information that contradicted it. I was aware that one of the primary characteristics of certain mental illnesses was the development of increasingly elaborate belief systems that became more fixed and resistant to contradiction as time passed. And yet, I could not shake the conviction that something had actually come home with me, something that was not simply a product of my own mind, but was an external entity that had attached itself to my presence. The sense of presence in my apartment grew more pronounced as days passed. I began to notice things that I had not paid attention to before, small alterations in the environment that suggested that something was indeed making itself known. Objects would be slightly out of place, not obviously moved, but positioned differently than I remembered placing them. The temperature in certain areas of the apartment would fluctuate for no apparent reason, becoming suddenly cold or warm in a way that did not correspond to any external weather pattern. I would sometimes hear sounds, subtle noises that seemed to come from no identifiable source, sounds that were almost but not quite language, almost but not quite recognizable. And there was the matter of my emotional state. I found myself becoming increasingly anxious as the days progressed, experiencing a kind of low-grade dread that seemed to originate not from external circumstances, but from something within or around me that I could not identify or control. I would find myself in moments of acute panic, my heart racing, my breathing shallow, my mind flooded with a sense of danger and threat that seemed to come from nowhere. These episodes would pass, leaving me exhausted and confused. Uncertain about what had triggered them, I began to consider seeking help, reaching out to someone who might be able to assist me in understanding what was happening. But I was paralyzed by the knowledge of how such an account would be received. If I described my experiences to a medical doctor or a mental health professional, they would almost certainly interpret what I was describing as symptoms of a psychiatric condition, possibly anxiety disorder or early-stage psychosis. If I described my experiences to someone from a religious tradition, they might interpret it as demonic possession or a spiritual attack, and the remedies that they suggested might be harmful or ineffective. If I reached out to paranormal investigators or spiritual practitioners, I would be entering a realm of belief and practice that I was not entirely convinced was legitimate. I was trapped in a kind of epistemic paralysis, unable to fully believe in what I was experiencing and unable to fully dismiss it as delusion. The evidence for something real existing in my apartment seemed to mount with each passing day, and yet the evidence was always subtle, always ambiguous, always capable of being explained away through rational mechanisms. I found myself oscillating between conviction and doubt, between the belief that something external was happening and the fear that I was experiencing the early stages of mental illness. It was during this period of uncertainty and anxiety that I first became aware of the possibility that whatever had come home with me might be feeding on my fear and anxiety. The more frightened I became, the more pronounced the phenomena seemed to become. When I was able to distract myself and maintain a relative state of calm, the sense of presence would diminish somewhat, becoming less obvious, less insistent. This observation suggested a feedback loop in which my fear was somehow strengthening whatever entity was in my apartment, while my calm and rationality were somehow weakening it or pushing it into the background. I made the decision to attempt a different approach. Rather than trying to investigate the phenomena or rationalize it away, I would attempt to respond to it with acceptance and curiosity rather than fear. This was extraordinarily difficult, running counter to every survival instinct and every cultural narrative that suggested I should be afraid of unexplained presences in my living space. But I decided that if something was indeed feeding on my fear, then the most effective response would be to refuse to feed it, to maintain a state of relative calm and acceptance regardless of what I observed or experienced. I began a practice of meditation and mindfulness, attempting to develop a kind of equanimous awareness of whatever was occurring in my apartment. When I noticed the temperature fluctuating, I simply noted it without judgment. When I heard unexplained sounds, I observed them with curiosity rather than alarm. When I felt the presence in the space around me, I acknowledged it without resistance. This approach required a tremendous amount of conscious effort and intention, as my natural tendency was to respond to these phenomena with anxiety and attempts at explanation. But over the course of several weeks, I found that my sustained practice, acceptance and non-resistance seemed to be having an effect. The phenomena did not disappear entirely, but they became less aggressive, less insistent. The sense of presence remained in my apartment, but it began to feel less like an invasion and more like a cohabitation, a kind of sharing of space with something that was not hostile, but was also not entirely benign. I began to think of the entity as something more like a roommate, a presence that occupied my space but did not necessarily pose a threat to me. This shift in perspective, subtle as it was, seemed to produce a corresponding shift in the way that the phenomena manifested themselves. Months passed, and I found myself settling into an unusual equilibrium with whatever had come home with me. The presence was still there. I still noticed unusual things happening in my apartment. I still sometimes felt the activation of anxiety when I was not maintaining my practice of acceptance. But the acute crisis that had characterized the first weeks of the experience had passed. I had found a way to coexist with the unknown, to maintain my daily life and my sanity, even in the face of phenomena that I could not fully understand or explain. I returned to work, and while I was not entirely transparent about my experience, I found that I could function reasonably well in the external world while maintaining my unusual living situation. I developed routines and practices that helped me maintain the mental and emotional stability necessary to continue existing in the space that I shared with something that was not entirely of this world, or at least not entirely explicable by the ordinary categories and frameworks that I use to understand reality. What I came to understand through this extended experience was that the boundary between the explicable and the inexplicable, between the rational and the irrational, between the physical and the non-physical, was far more permeable than I had previously believed. I had always lived with the assumption that the world could be understood through reason and scientific inquiry. That phenomena that could not be explained were simply phenomena that had not yet been adequately investigated. The experience of having something come home with me, something that could not be conclusively proven to exist, but that was undeniably real in its effects on my consciousness and my experience, had challenged this assumption in a fundamental way. I still do not fully understand what it is that shares my apartment with me. It is possible that it is a genuine paranormal entity, a presence from some realm beyond normal physical reality that has somehow attached itself to my existence. It is possible that it is a manifestation of my own psyche, a kind of externalized representation of some aspect of myself that I had been suppressing or denying. It is possible that it is something else entirely, something that does not fit neatly into any of the categories that I have available to make sense of experience. What I know is that it is real in the sense that matters most. It has altered the trajectory of my life. It has changed the way I understand myself and reality. It has forced me to develop new ways of thinking and being in the world that would not have emerged without its presence. I reached home that night after a mundane evening of social obligation, expecting to find the familiar refuge of my apartment unchanged and unchanged by my absence. But something came with me, something that has remained with me in the months and years since that evening. It has not been a pleasant cohabitation, and it has not been without cost to my mental health and my sense of security, but it has also been, in its way, transformative. The presence in my apartment has taught me something about the limits of my understanding, something about the necessity of developing tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, something about the possibility that reality is far more strange and vast than the comfortable frameworks we typically use to navigate it. I reached home, but I was not alone, and in learning to live with the presence that came home with me, I have learned something essential about what it means to be human in a world that is far more mysterious and unknowable than we generally acknowledge. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. I reached home, but something came with me, continued. The acceptance that I had developed with regard to the presence in my apartment proved to be the beginning of a more complex relationship rather than a resolution of the initial crisis. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself developing what could almost be described as a familiarity with the entity, learning to recognize the subtle ways that it made itself known, developing an intuitive sense for when it was more active and when it seemed to retreat into the background. I began to notice patterns in its behavior that suggested a kind of intelligence or intentionality that went beyond the random manifestations that had initially characterized its presence. It seemed to respond to my emotional states in increasingly sophisticated ways, not simply feeding on fear as I had initially theorized, but seeming to engage with me in something approximating a dialogue. Though a dialogue conducted entirely through the alteration of the physical environment, rather than through any form of conventional communication, the most striking manifestation of this apparent intentionality came one evening, approximately 4 months after the entity had first made its presence known. I had been attempting to read, sitting on my couch with a book that I had been struggling to concentrate on for several weeks. The book was a philosophical work about the nature of consciousness and reality, a text that explored questions about the relationship between mind and matter, about whether consciousness was a fundamental feature of the universe or merely an emergent property of sufficiently complex physical systems. I had been drawn to this book precisely because of the questions it raised, questions that seemed increasingly relevant to my attempts to understand the nature of the presence in my apartment. As I was reading a passage that discussed the possibility of consciousness existing independent of physical form, the temperature in the room dropped precipitously. My breath became visible, condensing into small clouds of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. The light from my lamps seemed to dim, as though something was absorbing the energy being produced by the bulbs. I sat very still, observing this phenomenon with the kind of equanimous attention that I had been practicing, maintaining my awareness without allowing fear to dominate my emotional response. And then, very slowly, words began to appear on the blank page that faced me in the open book. Words that were not printed, but that seemed to be manifesting on the paper as though something was writing them in real time. The words were simple and direct. "I am not what you think I am." I stared at these words for a long moment, my mind racing through various interpretations and implications. The entity had made itself known through environmental manipulations, but this was the first instance in which it had seemed to communicate through language, through the creation of meaningful symbols that could be interpreted as a direct message. My immediate response was to recognize this as a significant escalation in the nature of our interaction, a shift from the entity simply inhabiting my space to it actively attempting to communicate something about itself. I closed the book carefully, marking my place and set it aside. I sat in the cold darkness of my apartment, my breath visible as mist, my mind attempting to process what had just occurred. Had I imagined it? Had I somehow created those words myself, projecting them onto the page through some form of unconscious action? I retrieved the book and opened it to the page where the words had appeared. The words were gone. The page was blank once more, unmarked by any visible trace of what I had just witnessed. And yet, I had undeniably seen them, had read them with perfect clarity, had processed their meaning and their implication. The question of how the words could have manifested and then disappeared was less puzzling to me than it might have been months earlier. I had learned that the phenomena associated with the presence operated according to rules that did not correspond to ordinary physics. I stood and moved to my bedroom, intending to try to sleep despite the unusual nature of what had just occurred. But as I lay in bed, I found myself unable to suppress my thoughts about what the message might mean. I am not what you think I am. This suggested that the entity had been observing my thoughts and my understanding of it, that it was aware of my interpretations and wanted to correct them in some way. But I realized that I had never formed a coherent understanding of what the presence actually was. I had moved from fear to acceptance to a kind of pragmatic cohabitation, but I had never really attempted to develop a comprehensive theory about its nature or its origins. Perhaps that was what the message was responding to. Not my incorrect theory, but my lack of any clear theory at all. In the days following this manifestation, I found myself becoming increasingly preoccupied with the question of what the presence actually was. The entity's apparent desire to communicate suggested a level of self-awareness and intentionality that moved it beyond the category of a simple haunting or a spontaneous manifestation of my own psychological disorder. It was suggesting, through its message, that there was a discrepancy between what I thought it was and what it actually was, which implied that I had formed some kind of understanding or assumption about it. The most obvious assumption that I had made was that it was hostile or dangerous, that it had attached itself to me without consent and was somehow feeding on my anxiety and fear. But the entity's message seemed to be suggesting that this understanding was incorrect. I decided to attempt a more direct form of communication. I obtained a notebook and a pen, and I positioned myself at my desk with the intention of writing down my thoughts and questions about the entity, essentially creating a space in which it might be able to respond. I began by writing the date and time, and then I wrote out my first question: "What are you?" I sat back and waited, unsure of what I was expecting to happen, uncertain whether this attempt at communication would produce any response at all. The apartment remained silent for several minutes. The temperature was normal, the lights steady, the usual background presence that I had learned to recognize as the entity's activity, seemingly absent or quiescent. And then, very slowly, my hand moved across the page without my conscious intention. The movement was strange and unsettling, a sensation of my hand being moved by something external while my consciousness remained present and aware. Words began to appear on the page, written in a handwriting that was not quite my own, though it emerged from my hand. The words read, "I am the part of you that knows you are incomplete. I am what you rejected when you became who you think you are. I am the possibility you sacrificed when you chose safety over authenticity. I am not separate from you, though I have learned to exist in the spaces between your awareness and your actions." I read these words with a sense of profound disorientation. The message suggested that the entity was not external to me, but rather was some kind of manifestation or representation of an aspect of myself that I had somehow disowned or separated from. This was a theory that I had briefly considered months earlier, but it had seemed less plausible than the possibility that something external had attached itself to me. And yet, there was something deeply resonant about this explanation. Something that seemed to align with aspects of my experience that I had not fully processed. The message continued, written through my hand without my deliberate intention: "You have built a life around control and order and the careful management of your appearance and your emotions. You have become someone who fits into the world in ways that are acceptable, but that require constant vigilance and suppression. I am what emerges when you stop fighting that suppression. I am what you could become if you allowed yourself to be as you actually are rather than as you think you should be." I pulled my hand away from the page, breaking the connection that seemed to be allowing this unusual communication. I sat back in my chair, my mind struggling to process the implications of what the entity had communicated through the automatic writing. If the presence in my apartment was indeed some manifestation of a disowned aspect of myself, then what I had been experiencing was not a haunting, but rather a kind of internal psychological process that was manifesting in external form. The phenomena that I had attributed to some external entity, the temperature changes, the mystery, those sounds, the alterations in my environment, might all be manifestations of my own unconscious mind attempting to communicate something important about myself that my conscious mind had been resisting. But accepting this explanation created its own set of problems. If the presence was myself, then how could I be experiencing it as something other than myself? How could I be terrified by my own psyche in the way that I had been? How could I have engaged in attempts to understand and communicate with something that was, according to this theory, simply an externalized manifestation of my own internal processes? The experience of encountering something that seemed genuinely other, genuinely separate from my own consciousness, was so vivid and so compelling that it resisted the kind of reductionist explanation that would suggest it was all happening within my own mind. I spent the following days in a state of considerable confusion and internal conflict. I would attempt to engage in rational analysis of what was occurring, trying to apply psychological principles to explain the phenomena, and I would feel like I was close to understanding. But then something would happen, a manifestation of the presence, an inexplicable change in the environment, a sense of being in the company of something genuinely other, that would undermine my rational understanding and pull me back toward the conviction that something external and independent was actually occurring. It was during this period that I began to recognize that the dichotomy between external entity and internal manifestation might itself be a false binary, that there might be possibilities for understanding the phenomenon that transcended this particular categorical distinction. What if consciousness itself was not confined to individual minds? What if it was possible for aspects of consciousness to manifest in ways that did not conform to the boundaries between self and other that we typically took for granted? What if what was happening in my apartment was not evidence that I was going crazy, but rather evidence that my understanding of the nature of mind and consciousness was incomplete? That reality was far more strange and interconnected than conventional frameworks allowed. These were not comfortable thoughts. They challenged the basic epistemological foundations that I had built my life upon. And yet, the more I considered them, the more they seemed to align with the actual character of my experience. The presence in my apartment seemed to be neither purely external nor purely internal, but rather something that existed in a liminal space between these categories, something that could not be adequately explained through recourse to either materialist reduction or purely psychological explanation. As autumn turned to winter and the seasons shifted around me, my relationship with the presence in my apartment underwent another transformation. The sharp anxiety that had characterized the initial encounter had largely faded, replaced by something more like resignation or acceptance. But alongside this acceptance, there had emerged a kind of curious engagement, an interest in understanding the presence not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be explored. I had developed routines and practices that seemed to facilitate a kind of communication between myself and the entity, or between different aspects of myself if the presence was indeed a manifestation of my own psyche rather than something external. I noticed that my life was beginning to change in subtle but significant ways. I found myself becoming more honest in my interactions with other people, less willing to maintain the careful facades and controlled presentations that had previously characterized my social behavior. I began to express opinions and preferences that I had previously suppressed, to make choices based on what I actually wanted, rather than on what I thought I should want. My colleagues at work began to comment on the changes they were noticing in my demeanor and behavior. Some of these comments were positive, suggesting that I seemed more authentic and more engaged with my work. Others were more questioning, with people asking if something was different about me or if something had happened to change my outlook. The changes in my behavior and my presentation began to affect my relationships with people in more significant ways. I had been in a long-term relationship with someone named Michelle before the presence had made itself known, though the relationship had been characterized by a kind of emotional distance that seemed to result from my own inability to be fully authentic within it. As I began to become more authentic in my general approach to life and interaction, I found myself increasingly uncomfortable with the emotional constraints and the careful management of self that the relationship had demanded. I made the decision to end the relationship, a choice that was painful but that felt necessary and honest in a way that remaining in the relationship would not have been. The dissolution of this significant relationship forced me to confront some difficult questions about what my life was becoming and whether the changes that the present seemed to be catalyzing in me were positive or destructive. I found myself isolated in ways that I had not experienced before, living alone in my apartment with the presence that I had come to recognize as an integral part of my existence, but without the external relationships and social connections that typically provide meaning and structure to human life. I began to wonder if the presence was indeed pushing me toward some kind of authentic self-expression, or whether it was isolating me from normal human connection in ways that might ultimately be harmful to my well-being. These concerns reached a kind of crisis point one evening in early winter when I found myself in a state of acute despair. The isolation that I was experiencing, combined with the fundamental uncertainty about the nature of what was happening in my apartment and whether my increasing strangeness was a sign of genuine psychological deterioration, became overwhelming. I sat in my darkened apartment, contemplating the possibility that I should seek professional help, should attempt to report what was happening to me to a mental health professional who might be able to provide some kind of intervention or explanation. But as I was contemplating this possibility, the presence made itself known in a way that was more forceful and more direct than it had been in previous encounters. The temperature in the room dropped to a level that was genuinely uncomfortable, close to dangerous. Every surface in my apartment became covered with a thin layer of frost. The light seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating a kind of darkness that went beyond mere absence of illumination. And in the midst of this extreme manifestation, I heard something that approximated language, though it did not come through the conventional mechanism of sound waves traveling through the air. The message was communicated directly to my consciousness, arriving fully formed with a clarity and directness that made conventional speech seem primitive by comparison. "You are not broken," the presence communicated, its message carrying a kind of urgent intensity. "You are becoming." The process is uncomfortable and disorienting because it requires the dissolution of structures that have provided you with a false sense of security and control. But the outcome is not illness or deterioration. The outcome is integration, the recovery of capacities and aspects of yourself that you have learned to deny and suppress. Do not allow others to convince you that this process is pathological. Trust what you are experiencing. Trust the transformation that is occurring. This message, delivered with such force and such apparent conviction, seemed to settle something within me. The despair that I had been experiencing did not entirely disappear, but it was supplemented by a renewed sense of purpose and direction. I recognized that I was indeed in the midst of a transformation, that the changes I was experiencing in my thoughts and behaviors and relationships were not symptoms of illness, but rather indicators of a genuine alteration in how I was being and existing in the world. The presence in my apartment, whether it was external or internal, was catalyzing this transformation, was pushing me toward a way of being that was more authentic and more fully integrated than what I had been before. As winter progressed and the months continued to accumulate, I began to develop a kind of narrative about my experience that seemed to reconcile some of the contradictions that had been troubling me. The presence that had come home with me was, I came to understand, a manifestation of possibility, a kind of externalized representation of the aspects of myself that had been suppressed in the service of creating an acceptable social identity. It was not hostile, though it could seem threatening from the perspective of the part of myself that was invested in maintaining the status quo. It was not alien, though it could seem other because it represented dimensions of myself that had been separated from my conscious awareness for so long that they felt unfamiliar and strange. What I came to recognize through sustained engagement with the prise, then CE, was that the process of becoming a particular kind of person in the social world necessarily involves the suppression and denial of other possible ways of being. In order to become the kind of person who could function in society, who could maintain employment and relationships and a respectable reputation, I had learned to suppress the parts of myself that were unconventional, that wanted different things, that questioned the basic premises on which my life had been constructed. The presence in my apartment was the return of these suppressed aspects, the manifestation of the possibility that I could choose a different way of being, that I did not have to remain forever confined by the structures and constraints that I had internalized. The cohabitation that I had established with the presence was, I came to understand, a form of integration, an attempt to reconcile the suppressed parts of myself with the person I had become, to create a synthesis that would allow me to be both functional within the social world and authentic to dimensions of myself that the social world typically demands be denied. This was not an easy process, and it was not always clear whether it was succeeding. But what became clear over the course of the year following the initial manifestation of the presence was that I had fundamentally changed, that I was no longer capable of living in the way that I had lived before, and that this change, while disorienting and sometimes frightening, was also in some deep sense necessary and right. By the time a full year had passed since that first evening when I returned home from dinner and became aware of the unusual quality of the air in my apartment, I found myself living a life that looked quite different from the life I had been living before. I had left my corporate job and was working freelance, engaging in projects that I found personally meaningful, rather than ones that simply paid well and advanced a career trajectory that I had never truly invested in. I had developed genuine friendships with people who seemed to value authenticity and self-expression rather than social performance. I had moved away from the apartment where the presence had first made itself known, partly because I felt that I no longer needed the external symbol of something other in order to access the otherness that existed within me, partly because the apartment had become a kind of anchor to that early phase of the transformation that I felt ready to move beyond. And the presence itself seemed to have transformed as well. It was no longer something that manifested itself through dramatic environmental alterations or through the kind of urgent communication that had characterized the early period of our interaction. Instead, it had become something more subtle, more integrated, something that I could access through my own consciousness without needing it to manifest in the external world in obvious ways. I had learned to recognize it as a kind of internal voice, a perspective that I could call upon when I needed to question my own assumptions or challenge my own patterns of thought and behavior. Looking back on the year that had passed, I found myself understanding the experience not as a haunting or as a sign of illness, but as a kind of initiatory process, a journey that had taken me from a state of unconscious conformity to a state of conscious choice about how to live and who to be. The presence that had come home with me that night after an ordinary evening of social obligation had proved to be one of the most significant forces in my life, not in spite of its apparent strangeness and its resistance to conventional explanation, but precisely because of these qualities. It had forced me to question my basic assumptions about the nature of reality and consciousness, about what was possible and what was not possible, about the boundaries between sanity and madness, between self and other. I reached home that night carrying within me the seeds of transformation, though I did not know it at the time. Something came with me, something that changed everything about how I understood myself and my life. And while I could never definitively explain what that something was, I came to appreciate that the inability to explain it, the fact that it resisted all conventional categories and frameworks, was perhaps the most important thing about it. It stood as a permanent reminder that reality is far more vast and strange than our ordinary concepts allow, that consciousness is not confined to the boundaries of individual minds, that the possibility of authentic self-expression and genuine transformation is always present, waiting for us to be willing to acknowledge and engage with it.